Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
Today on the Cognitive Crucible, we have two guests. Dr. Jan Kallberg is an assistant professor in political science with the Department of Social Sciences at the United States Military Academy and a research scientist with the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. Before joining the Army Cyber Institute at West Point, he was a researcher with the Cybersecurity Research and Education Institute, the University of Texas at Dallas, and an assistant professor with Arkansas Tech University. Dr. Kallberg earned his Ph.D. from the University of Texas at Dallas and holds a J.D. from the University of Stockholm. Also joining us is U.S. Army Colonel Stephen Hamilton, who is a cyber officer and former information systems management officer and former signal officer. He has held numerous command and staff assignments at the tactical and operational unit levels, as well as with the Joint Staff. Stephen is currently the technical director of the Army Cyber Institute. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science from the United States Military Academy, a Master of Science in Software Engineering from Auburn University, and a Ph.D. in computer science from Johns Hopkins University. Jan and Stephen, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us on.
I want to preface this real quick to say that for both Dr. Kallberg and Colonel Hamilton, their opinions are their own and do not represent the Army or the Department of Defense. And I would also like to extend a special thank you to Colonel Hamilton. We always appreciate having active duty service members on the Cognitive Crucible and appreciate his time and service. So, gentlemen, I would like to start with calling out to our audience that you guys recently co-authored a piece called How to Protect Troops from an Assault in the Cognitive Domain. And of course, we will have a link to this article in the show notes. I would like to read a short passage from this article and then jump into a discussion which touches on some pretty big topics such as constitutional rights, training and education, and leadership. So here, let me read this short passage and then we will hop into the discussion. Quote, "Great power competition will require force protection for our minds, as hostile near-peer powers will seek to influence U.S. troops. Influence campaigns can undermine the American will to fight, and the injection of misinformation into a cohesive fighting force are threats equal to any other hostile and enemy action by adversaries and terrorists. Maintaining the will to fight is key to mission success." Central to your article are concepts, and we just read these concepts, such as the will to fight and force protection. Could we start, please, with these concepts? And could you please link them up to the cognitive domain? And whoever would like to start, take it away.
So John, I maybe start, and let me take the will to fight, and then I'll let Stephen take the part that's regarding the links to force protection. So historically, the will to fight has been crucial through developments in time and how people perceived the fighting environment. Hardware, guns, supplies is naturally of value, but if there's no will to fight, or that has deteriorated, you have no longer a fighting force. One example of how the Romans perceived Hannibal's elephants. So the elephants themselves to Hannibal was likely more dangerous to the Carthaginians themselves and maybe Hannibal personal than they had any real impact on the actual fight. But the Roman perceived the elephants to be a super weapon, almost like Goebbels talked about this Wunderwaffe, which changed the course of Second World War. So already there was at a disadvantage because they were super concerned about the super weapon and it deteriorated their will to fight. Through history, we've seen how this will to fight is crucial to go the extra mile and to really try hard under harsh circumstances, to endure hardships, weather, climate, malnutrition, disease, and so forth. So we can also see examples of where the will to fight have succeeded, like Valley Forge, where there was 100 reasons for the American revolutionaries to say, this is it, I'm done here, by eating, rotten oxtail soup. Leading this forward, I think it's a concern that we have is the will of fight. We take that as a given. We look on the greatest generation. We look on those who volunteered to be rangers with no extra pay out of infantry divisions to climb the rocks on D-Day at huge prices. Volunteers for no monetary compensation or fame. They volunteered because they had the will to fight. And a concern that we had when we start thinking about this is, are we stuck in the 60s and the 50s where we believe that these greatest generations will of fight never been tampered with and it's intact? And as we start to look at it, we say that this digital environment maybe have a very dangerous effect that we have a hard time of estimating. But we also can assume, based on the modus operandi of, let's say, the Russians and so on, they paid attention to it. They understand that there is a undercurrent that we don't see, and that that they could create channels and so forth where they can influence our troops and their families already in peacetime and to soften up our will to fight. So that was a little short. And I hand over to Stephen to talk about how that links to force protection.
Yeah, and I think if we look at how do we haven't really had this problem, in our forces in quite a while. And so the fact that the internet has been able to provide, information that is from all over the world, the possibility for a country to affect the will to fight is possible, if not probable. And there's really no mechanism for us to understand this. I mean, there's no mechanism for us to even try to fight against it. And so that's where we come up with the term cognitive force protection, because every Army commander knows what force protection is. I mean, we could talk about that to any officer in the military, and they'll be like, oh yeah, that's, we're at FPCon Alpha or whatever. I mean, we have codes for it. Everybody knows exactly what that is. But now, you send your soldiers back to your barracks room, and they get on the internet, and all of a sudden they're being influenced by, another adversary. It could be Russia or China. They could be posing as someone from the U.S., and the soldier has no idea what's going on. So even though that they're behind these gates and we're closed off, on post in the barracks room, you're being influenced by someone from another country. And I think that we've got to come to a realization that this is happening, or we're going to be blindsided.
Right. Thanks for that, both of you. Force protection is something that's obviously necessary. The term itself is a little bit of a, I don't know if paradox is the right word, but we're talking about the Department of Defense here: soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and they're the ones that are actually doing the fighting, and yet they also need protection. So it's a bit of a curious term, but I think you make the case well that we used to deploy overseas into faraway lands, and the times that the force needed protecting might be when they're out on liberty somewhere in a foreign country, or at least that was my experience when I was on active duty. I was talking with Jan before we started here that my first introduction to force protection was in the early 1990s on liberty in the Mediterranean in, say, Italy or Spain. It's like, okay, gang, we're getting ready to go out on liberty. Here's your liberty brief. Follow the buddy system and have a good time. And there's the shore patrol if anybody gets into trouble as well. But now we have this information conflict, which is 24/7. And it's not only affecting Department of Defense service members, but it's affecting the entire world and, of course, the American population in the West. Thank you, Jan, for talking about Hannibal and the elephants. In your article, you also give another historical example, which is instructive. Could you recap what happened with the French in World War II and leading up to World War II?
So we looked on different situations where the will of fight was lost. So in the 1920s, the French political arena was like a kaleidoscope of right-wing parties, communist, socialist, authoritarian, fascist, that was inspired by Mussolini, later Hitler, political violence, cleavage, anarchists, a lot of turmoil and no steady government. And people got fed up with government and said, oh, we can't get our stuff together. And defending France didn't become lost importance. And they were also heavily invested in undermining that. The communists, by the support of Stalin and Soviet Union, were funded to drive this to a revolutionary state. And of course, Germans fed the authoritarians saying, why should they fight us? We're brothers in arms. Let's take on somebody else, the communists and so forth. And so when it moves up to 1939, Ribbentrop, who was the German foreign minister and the military intelligence, they were pretty sure that Western allies wouldn't defend Poland. So there would be no Second World War. We take over Poland, we close the business. Because they assessed that the will of fight in France was not there. And France had, they invited dive bombing. They had the same amount of tanks, even if they were not well coordinated. They have almost like equal the size of German army. The war starts, is the declared war. They invade France, and the French army collapse. They were not eager to fight. They were more eager to surrender. They wanted to head back. The will was eroded. And I think that's a good example to see that the will of fight is not eroded at the moment of combat. It is eroded decades in advance, leading up to that point. And that raised, of course, our concern, what type of erosion is ongoing right now. Because we have a tendency to look back and Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge, like really steady will to fight, the American hold the line, and we see that as our will to fight. But is that still relevant with the digital manipulation and what we always can see as our adversaries is prepping the battlefield as we speak, but instead of prepping it by eroding the will to fight in our fighting force.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things is that everything gets a little blurred when you think about what the battlefield is. Because if we're saying that the preparation of the battlefield is our soldiers being hacked, if you will, cognitively from other countries, I mean that's happening now. That's happening before we even begin to see an actual armed conflict. And so I think to me it just seems important. For us to come to a realization of what's happening and what's also what's possible in the even more so in the future as we become more connected and the truth of what things are become more blurred.
Have either of you come across, or perhaps you've done some thinking about this, about how might you actually assess the will to fight without having to wait to find out when it's too late?
I think one thing is that we're an all-volunteer force, and that's kind of a hallmark of our military. And so, if we start to see like it's poor recruitment, that could be an indicator. But we also, even though we're all volunteer, you're still kind of locked in for a term. at least. And so I think if you were to break that will to fight after you signed up, that's probably that would probably be the Achilles heel of it all. Because if you volunteered in the first place, then your will to fight is probably okay.
Thanks for all that, gentlemen. It dawns on me that some people in our audience may not be familiar with the way service members deploy and operate worldwide. I'm curious, what is the current DoD policy on service members having their personal cell phones, et cetera, while they are deployed? Let me lead the question just a little bit more. I can imagine that maybe 5, 7, 10 years ago, it was a lot more common for people to actually carry with them their own personal devices. But today, I suspect that might not be the case. And can you use this as a way to maybe contrast the different environments between a deployed environment and then the home station environment relative to force protection? I'll let either one of you guys take that in whatever direction you want.
Okay, I can take that. I've been in, but between being in school and cybercom and being at West Point, I've been a little bit out of the force-com type forces for a while. But from what I understand, there's definitely deployments where cell phones are prohibited. But what I also kind of know is that soldiers do what soldiers do. They're going to bring them. They're going to sneak them. So I don't think we can 100% say that we could do that. I do know in my deployments when bad events happen or significant events happen, we had as a signal officer, we would have these blackout periods. So we would just black out comms until we could get a handle on the information that so that it could be presented correctly without having soldiers calling home and scaring everybody and not really understanding what the situation was. So but I will say that I did, as deployed, I actually had a cell phone that I used on the network, and this was a while ago. But it was just for coordination. If for some reason I needed help, I mean, it was just really a backup comms method. If I needed something, we didn't talk anything, not even unclassified. It would just be like, hey, I'm here or whatever, just kind of a report or something. But I would say that you could ban them as much as you want. It's probably still going to happen a little bit. There's probably still, I know in Iraq we had internet cafes, so there's still ways for soldiers to get online and get information. So it's the internet's ubiquitous. It's just no matter how much you think you can get away from it, there's always going to be somebody connected.
Right. I think that's a really good point, and this dovetails nicely into some other items that we wanted to talk about. Is getting into what are some of the suggestions that you would give to individual service members for their own personal cognitive security, but also what about leaders, and how should leaders be looking at this cognitive security threat and requirement? What are the kinds of things that you think the Army and DoD ought to be doing to surface this constructively and prevent the kinds of things that Jan was describing earlier from history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a few thoughts on this. It's really it's a real difficult problem. I think first off is identify the problem, which we've kind of done at this point by saying there is this cognitive force protection that we need to be thinking about. I was thinking this morning about how when I was at Fort Hood, I remember that there were certain bars and certain seedy places that would be banned by the post, and the commanding general would say no soldiers can go to this location, and you really can't do that. Like, let's say that there's some extremist website, we can't tell soldiers you can't go to these websites. I mean, it's just even if you did, there would be absolutely no way to enforce it. I mean, you're not going to send a sergeant major to look at the network traffic. I mean, you would send a sergeant major that could go check on that institution or that bar or whatever it is that no soldiers could be on, or an MP or something. You can't really do that on the internet. So So that presents a challenge, and the internet's good at using stories to kind of get you in this echo chamber, and then all of a sudden you're in this path where you believe a totally alternate version of reality. And so I think my personal thought as when I was a company commander would be, part of it would be just communication, just trying to explain, hey, there's stuff on the internet that's just, you got to understand that it's not true. I mean, there's an old commercial, I think, that said, well, they say something completely false, and the person says, well, where'd you get that from? And they said, oh, I read it on the internet, so it must be true. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's a joke now, but it's not. I mean, still people, like, if you have a compelling story, you believe it. Your mind automatically wants to believe it. I mean, that's why, there's so many clickbait ads of, like, this actress that, from the 80s, like, guess what she looks like now? And there's, everybody wants to click on that because it leaves you hanging. You have to know they created a knowledge gap. So, and then as you click down in, all of a sudden you're on some crazy, Flat Earth Society website. So it's important, I think, to first, I think we have to acknowledge it. And then second, we have to say, like I think Jan and I've discussed is this, and I believe we mentioned in the article briefly, is maybe coming up with, here are the recommended news sources. Here are the news sources that we say have legitimate information that's not too far out there. So that's part of it. But what you can't really do is the social media part. That even becomes harder, because now things are being shared and information. I mean, it's we've talked before about you may have heard the term barracks lawyer. So it used to be that, the soldier was getting an Article 15 or whatever it was, and then there would be some other soldier that said, "Oh yeah, well, this is what you have to do. This is what got me off when I last got in trouble," and they tell him some really bad information that's just not true, and then the soldier does it, gets in worse trouble or whatever it may be. And now that barracks lawyer is the internet. I mean, you can go and find a solution to any problem you have, whether it be wrong or right. And so that becomes a challenge. And I think probably just communication with the soldiers and trying to make sure that they're okay is what we can do. But that's a really challenging problem.
Yeah, one of my colleagues at the Information Professionals Association, Dr. Rand Waltzman, has a saying about information warfare in general, is that it's a chronic problem and there is no solution, but it may be managed. And so I think that may be what you're describing as well. It's like, we can't legislate this problem away with rules, but we can teach our people, our population, our leaders, some ways that it can potentially be managed, and including get your news, get your information from a variety of sources. Don't just accept whatever the inflammatory tweet says as gospel. Verify, right? We also had on the podcast a gentleman, Dr. Rand Paul, who wrote a pretty influential article called The Firehood of Falsehood. I encourage everybody to check that out as well. Jan, did you have any thoughts along these lines?
So I was, when we talked about this, how you do that. Well, first, as Usma always says, we produce leaders of character. I think if you show a good example and you're loyal to the Constitution and you try to be honest and invite people to discuss things with you as an officer, I think that's really good. That the officer shows really through their character who they are. We also work with cybersecurity and security in general. We know we start to advertise where the bad websites are. It's just going to, almost like advertisement. People tend to do, if you say don't go there, then they go there. So I think that's, as Stephen said, that's technically impossible. Also, I think that people are, my dad always said, people are always lazy. Try to make it easy for them. And I think, let's say it this way. Through USMA, I have access to Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post. And I don't think it costs the academy so much, maybe a few dollars per employee to give me that access, but I also read these sources. So I think the DoD can do it very simple. They could, yes, if they contacted 20 newspapers of different tendencies in the country, Dallas Morning News and whatever, LA Times, and said, we want to put you behind a CAC wall, behind a smart card wall, so we know who's watching, and give access to all the service members, or maybe our civilians, employees, and so forth. I think the news outlets would be happy to do so. So we have a lot of sources when it comes to training and so forth that is behind, I wouldn't say a paywall, that's behind where our CAC cards, that our ID cards, we have to log in, but then we got educational resources, training for IT security. You can have news outlets there too. And I believe a lot of service members that they can just quickly sign in and they got all these newspapers and news outlets access to that. That would be a point of acquiring news and information. And I think that's a really low cost thing to do.
Well, definitely a lot to think about, and these are early days, but the threat is vivid and needs addressing right away for sure.
Yeah, I have something else I'd just like to say. It just made me think of this. I read this was maybe a year or so ago that in England that they were teaching in the schools. They had actually a misinformation class, and I think of the Army as one of the things we do is we do training, and we do it all the time, and from sexual harassment training, all the different mandatory trainings we have. It would be a logical thing, I think, to really look at maybe a misinformation training and just trying to explain to the soldiers, like, not everything is what you think it is, and everything you hear on the internet, you should figure out how to question. And I would even say, I teach computer science, and one of the things that I do in class is sometimes I make a mistake and I'll code something wrong, or an error will come up on the screen. And I always use that as a teaching point. I say, okay, this may happen to you, because if I made the mistake, then you could easily make the same mistake. And I show them, how do you go about debugging and Googling and figuring out how to do it? And maybe we could take that same kind of idea and say, look, okay, let's just throw out some crazy piece of information that was out on the internet, and then show how to use different news sources to debunk it. And I think that, and especially if you get something that's really kind of catchy or crazy, I think the soldiers would be interested in it and would be able to sit through a class and at least have the tools necessary to be able to question and then go back and validate or invalidate the information that they've received.
That sounds like a really productive direction to go, especially because it sounds like what you're describing is not a lecture format. Like, okay, guys, here we go. Everybody get into the lecture hall, sit down. We're all going to do this for an hour. Here we go. I think for today's cohort is maybe even for previous cohorts was maybe not the most effective way of teaching material, but something that's experiential and obviously relevant to today's activities is a great way to go. I'd like to conclude by asking you if you're aware of any online or materials or books that are related to this topic, or anything else that would be related potentially to cognitive security. Could you recommend something to our audience if they want to take a deeper dive into some of these topics?
Yeah, absolutely. I would first say that if someone wants to read something that's pretty quick, we have a publication called the Cyber Defense Review. In fact, Jan's one of the chief editors on that. And our information warfare publication that was the summer of 2020 has some good articles in it, but one that I will definitely call out that I read and I'm you know, I plan to keep reading it like over again because it's so impactful to me. Is it's called The Truth Dies First: Story Weapons on the Info Ops Battlefield, and it's by Rennie Gleason. And I'll tell you a quick story on this. Is our prior good friend of mine was our prior information warfare team lead, Colonel Bob Ross, and he and I were talking one day, and he comes up to me and he says, "Hey," he's like, you know, we're still trying to figure out information warfare, but there's a whole industry who's been understanding this well before the Army even started thinking about it. And it turns out it's the advertising industry. Because you think about it, they're trying to influence you to buy a product. I mean, the difference, you know, the methods are still the same. The difference is what they're trying to do. And so Rennie Gleason is phenomenal. And he wrote this great article. There's also some really good, I think he does a couple there's a couple good TED Talks that he's done before, but he works for an advertising agency. And it is, I think, let me see. Yeah, Wyden and Kennedy, which is the world's largest independent creative ad agency. And he really lays out some very thoughtful things about how if you think of, you know, like I was talking about earlier, the clickbaiting, if you think of this, if the story's told well, very quickly, and you can understand it, and it induces emotion, then you tend to believe it. And so that's one that I would say, read that if you don't have a lot of time. If you have all the time in the world, he mentions a book in here that I'm still not fully through. I'm almost through with it. It's Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And he goes into the psychology of what he calls in the book System 1 and System 2. So you have your System 1, which is your immediate reaction, which is your fight or flight, like all of those, like your impulse, your feelings. That's the first thing that happens when your brain starts to hear an idea and start to do something with it. And then there's the thoughtful piece. And usually what he talks about in the book, I think, is when you start multiplying double-digit numbers, like try to do that in your head, you're going to have to stop and think. You're not going to be able to just come up with an answer. And so that's when your System 2 kicks in and says, okay, hold on. You can't just make this up. You actually got to put a higher level of thought into this. So that book, Thinking Fast and Slow, I think if you really want to delve into the psychology of why we do things, to me, it was kind of a very enlightening to better understand why I made my own personal decisions in certain situations. So those are two. And also, as we were talking, there's, you know, I think about ads and the ad agency and stuff like that. There's another book I read a long time ago. I'm sure plenty of you have read it out there, but it's called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. And I think if I remember right, it starts out with the this crazy story about, it used to be passed on the internet about a person wakes up in the hotel room and they're in a bathtub of ice water, and it turns out somebody harvested their kidney or something like that. And it's such a, like, it's crazy, possibly believable, and it follows their stickiness principle, and they use that as an example of how a story, you get completely false, will stick with you, and you'll continue to remember it, even though it has nothing to do with the truth. So I would say those would be good starting points for this subject to kind of understand what's going on.
Thanks, Stephen. Jan, do you have any thoughts?
I'd like to recommend an article by Aristides Mahairas and Mikhail Divilinski. They're also in Cyber Defense Review of fall 2018, called Disinformation. Aristides used to be the head of the Cyber Bureau for the FBI in New York, one of their biggest shops when it comes to cyber. Mikhail was one of their Russian-speaking agents in the FBI. And it's a short article, but I also say that their notes, which has about 15 references, reading their short article named Disinformation, and then maybe if you have time, take a look on their notes and their references for further reading. I think that's really good.
All right, gentlemen. And with that, Dr. Jan Kallberg and Colonel Stephen Hamilton, thank you so much for being part of the Cognitive Crucible.
we should thank you for letting us be on your podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was very enlightening and fun to talk about.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.